Great, Claire. Thank you so much for taking the time to come onto the podcast today.
Of course, Johnny, I'm so excited to be here. We're a long ways away, but I'm excited to be here virtually.
Yeah, I mean, it's always fun to talk with people in other time zones. The fact that it's 1 o'clock where I am and 8 a.m. you are, it's probably one of the more what can I say, normal of time differences and more sociable of times. I have done 6 a.m.s and 10 p.m.s in my podcast journey, so it's
Wow, yeah,
nice.
that's quite the time difference. I don't know, you're probably, I don't know what time you eat lunch, but you might be like in the digestion phase, whereas my
Yeah.
body's just waking up. I just told you I'm finishing my coffee, so I'm hoping my words come out okay, but we'll see as we get into it.
Yeah, we'll be fine. Yeah, I had my lunch a bit ago, just from a post-workout perspective. So
Mhm.
we're all good. So Claire, tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do, just in case they're not aware.
Yeah, so my name is Claire Chewning. Yes, that is my real last name. I know I get so many people who are like, I'm really disappointed your last name isn't Chewing. I'm like, well, we're close to it. Perfect name for a dietitian. And yep, I'm a registered dietitian, as well as a certified intuitive eating counselor. I'm the owner and founder of Yours Truly Nutrition, pun intended.
Yeah.
It's my virtual private practice where I work one-on-one with people from all over to help them heal their relationships with food, recover from chronic dieting, disordered eating. And we do all of that through the intuitive eating framework. So I work with people from all over. I've been doing that for about 4 years now. I've been in business full-time for myself. And when I'm not talking to clients or doing podcasts with people like you, I'm usually eating something, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich a lot of the time. I'm a big Swiftie as well. So if you hear me quote any Taylor Swift lyrics, you know where that's coming from. But yeah, that's what I like to do when I'm not working.
Great. Well, I mean, the Taylor Swift lyrics will mostly go over my head, apart from maybe the more obvious ones. But I did enjoy reading the business name of Yours Truly Nutrition. Is
Yes.
there a story there, or was that just the thing that came into your head?
A little bit of a story. It's funny if you ask my best friend, she will take credit for naming my business. She is equally as punny as I am.
Right.
Actually, in college when we lived together, we used to have pun wars back and forth. One
Mhm.
person would start, and then whoever cannot return the volley of a pun, you lose. So I knew I wanted to do some sort of pun because obviously my last name being so close to chewing and me being a dietitian, I could not pass up the opportunity. So we wanted to do something with my last name, and I decided that I was going to start a blog at the time when I was still a student before I could have a legitimate business. And I decided that I wanted to write everything in letter form, like dear reader, dear listener, whatever it was. So I would sign off all of the letters instead of yours truly. I would sign it yours truly. It just kind of rolled off the tongue. We came up with that idea together. So that's the story.
Right. Yeah. No, I like that. That's funny. Um, and how did you? Because you mentioned that you've been in business in this practice for about 4 years now.
Mhm.
And you mentioned that you're an intuitive eating counselor. And of course, we're going to talk a lot about unconditional permission to eat, relationships with food, and all the rest of it. How was your introduction into that space?
Into the intuitive eating space.
Yes.
Yeah, this is probably one of my favorite stories to tell. I'll
Mhm.
try to give you the Sparks Note version, but it's really tied in with kind of how I found the nutrition space as a whole. So I grew up, I was very privileged to have an upbringing around food where I had a great relationship with it. My dad was always cooking something in the kitchen. He's an amazing cook. He taught me a lot about food and how to be creative with it and how to flavor and cook all of these things. My mom was the baker in the
Right.
family. She's much more rule oriented. I learned from an early age that baking was not for me. Too many rules, too many measurements. I was like, I don't like this.
Yeah. You
Much more.
can't you can't really flex a baking recipe. It doesn't really
No,
work.
believe me, I've tried,
Yeah.
and 10 out of 10 would not recommend. So I really took a liking to cooking because you could be a lot more experimental and you could be kind of free flowing and creative. So I had this relationship with food growing up that was really fun and that I found a lot of satisfaction in. So when you start to get to that age where people ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do? I don't know. You're like a teenager. And does any teenager really know? I'm not sure. But I
No.
knew that I wanted to do something related to food. And I did a little bit of research trying to figure out what that could be. And I realized a registered dietitian was a thing, was a profession that existed. So fast forward a little bit, I go to school, obviously here in the US, go Dukes, if anyone's familiar with JMU, but I studied nutrition. And ironically, throughout my schooling to become a registered dietitian, my own relationship with food took a turn.
Right.
Because I don't know how your schooling or your training is, but here in the States, our nutrition schooling is very weight focused. It's very weight centric and it's very calories in, calories out. And there isn't a whole lot of talk about mental health with food and the relationship to food. It's just very science by the book. And I can appreciate that to a certain extent, but it doesn't really teach you how to relate to people around food. And it kind of gave me the impression that if I was going to be a registered dietitian or someone who people looked to for nutrition information, then I had to be the perfect eater. Now, I know your viewers probably can't see us. I'm putting that in air quotes because there is no such thing as a perfect eater or a perfect diet, but I was under this impression that I had to be perfect. And as you can imagine, that really kind of sent my relationship with food into a not so helpful direction. So towards the end of my schooling, when I had become more restrictive in my eating and I wasn't really having fun with food anymore, I actually discovered the intuitive eating book around this point in time. It was my final year of schooling to become a dietitian. I was in the library. I don't know, that might sound antiquated, but I was in a library and I found the intuitive eating book. And it's the first edition of the book by Evelyn
Wow.
Tribole and Elise Resch. Now they're on the fourth edition. So this is a while ago, but I picked up the book and I thought to myself, well, this could be helpful. Like, this sounds interesting. So I read it. It's probably the fastest I've ever read a book in my entire life because it really spoke to me and reminded me of what my relationship with food was like when I was younger, right? It was creative, it was fun, it was intuitive, for lack of a better term. And throughout my schooling, I had lost connection with that. And that was kind of the whole reason why I wanted to become a dietitian, right? Was to help people learn about food and not feel shameful about it or restricted by it. So when I read that book, I kind of knew in that moment that I wanted to use that not only for my personal relationship with food, but I wanted to adopt that practice and those principles in working with my future patients and clients, because I did not want to lead anyone else down that slippery slope with food that I had been led down by my schooling. So I don't mean to paint my schooling as it was all awful. I learned so many great things, but I've changed a little bit since then in the approach that I take with clients.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think it's a good way to start with that as the base, right? Because it's interesting how you talked about your parents and how your mum was more of a baker and your dad was a chef.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was much more fluid with his cooking. And although there are recipes with cooking, it's much more about flavors and
Mm-hmm.
feel and creating things, particularly if you're going to start doing your own thing with it. Whereas baking, as you said, you can't really do that. You've got to stick by the book. And it's funny how my schooling around nutrition sounds similar to yours in that you need to become aware of the science.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you're taught, is like science, numbers, facts,
Mm-hmm.
logic, research. And then when you get thrown out into the world of coaching other people, you're like, okay, facts, logic, numbers. And that's how you sort of approach things. And then as you gain more practice and also, as you said, dig deeper into your own relationship with food, you start to think, well, there's got to be more than this. Okay, I
Mm-hmm.
understand the science around weight change. I understand the science of nutrition. But actually, how do we apply that to living, breathing humans that have emotions?
Right. Because there's a big difference there, right? Like
Massive.
there's so much value in understanding the science, of course. Like as nutrition professionals, we have to. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I tell my clients, like the majority of the population, if you're just trying to eat and live a healthy lifestyle, whatever that means for you, you don't need to know the ins and outs of the Krebs cycle. You don't need to know that glycolysis ends in 2-pyruvate, right? So I think there's kind of a difference or a disconnect there that, yeah, we maybe come out of school and we have all of this knowledge and we're aware of the science, but if we don't know how to apply that to a living, breathing human being, like you said, who has emotions and who lives a real life, then it doesn't really connect. And I think that's where a lot of nutrition gets lost in translation, because it's so sciencey and it's so fact oriented, but we don't talk about, well, how does this actually look in day-to-day life? And what does that mean for me and how I fuel my body and my relationship with food?
Yeah, 100%. And the more data driven you get, it's interesting how the more out of touch you can find yourself with that. You know, I had a similar experience to you, I think, in terms of the numbers and um, the control around that. Because for me, my background was a bit more with regards to different diets in terms of, you know, low fat, low carb, Weight
Mhm.
Watchers, Slimming Worlds. I never did Slimming World, but you know, it's just that kind of aspect of life. And when I found nutrition education and the idea of numbers and calories and things like that, I found more flexibility in that than I had before. But then it
Mhm.
was still a rule, it was still an external control.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting to then switch things towards a more internal control, particularly for people who are focused on their weight, be it from a health perspective or from a body image perspective, which I'm sure both things will touch on. But it's interesting because you feel like you need some form of control because you've lost the ability to trust your internal signals.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, something that my clients and I talk about often, because just to give you and your audience an idea of who I work with. I work
Mhm.
with individuals who have been chronic dieters, right? They've been on and off diets. Maybe they've weight cycled a lot, right? That yo-yo dieting. Or I've even worked with people who are in recovery from an eating disorder or disordered eating in general, right? All of that happens on a spectrum. But we find as a result of all of those dieting or controlling or restrictive behaviors around food, that it disconnects them from their body or from that sense of internal control, for lack of a better term, right? I have so many people come to me because they hear the intuitive eating message of listen to your body or understand your internal hunger or fullness cues, and they feel really confused by that. And again, disconnected from those cues, because dieting or following any type of like external plan related to eating, I say, puts you in your mind when it comes to food rather than in your body. And not to say that that's all bad, right? I think we do have to have some sort of thinking and planning at times when it comes to food. But if we're totally in this relationship with food where we're not feeling in our bodies, we're not connecting to cues, I think that can become really problematic for a lot of people. So we're all about reconnecting to those cues here.
Yeah, yeah, and 100% is where I do a lot of work with the similar demographic and the similar stand.
Mhm.
It's that almost objection you get when you're beginning to work with someone around the need for structure
Mhm.
and the need for control, because it's interesting, isn't it, how although these diet cycles have manifested through too much control, it's very, very difficult to then instantly lose like all the sense of external control. And as
Mhm.
you said, we're trying to develop internal regulation,
Mhm.
but that is super scary, isn't it, for people who are like, well, I've in the past I've been told either how many calories to eat or how many points I've got, or I've just followed this meal plan. And now you're telling me I need to make these decisions for myself. You know, like they're like, give me a food list,
Yeah.
give me something to
Yeah.
follow.
Yeah. I mean, when you've been subbing out those decisions to something like a calorie tracker or a meal plan, a food plan, it makes total and complete sense why even the thought of straying from those things feels really scary, right? Because if that has been that sense of control, or a lot of the times those programs kind of come with this idea that you can't be trusted around food. So you need this device to tell you how much, when, or what to eat, or you need this plan. So a lot of times people are operating from this place of not having trust in their body. So the thought of throwing those plans totally to the wayside is really scary. And I've had so many people come to me be like, I want to get there eventually, but I'm not there yet. And I say, that's totally fine. We can step our way there, right? Day by day. I tell my clients we're going to take things bite by bite, one bite at a time. But I think it can be really helpful if any listeners are kind of starting to wonder about their relationship with food or wanting to improve it, to start to consider what it might feel like to loosen the grip a little bit. Loosen the grip. What might it be like to let go a little bit of that control?
Yeah, I think it's great to mention that about doing it step by step or
Mhm.
bite by bite, as you mentioned, because of that need to have that control and that fear of losing a sense of control. And it's interesting how a lot of these people, and I was definitely in that same boat as well, who have gone from diet to diet, who end up sabotaging their own progress, essentially. They feel like they're making headway, and then whatever reason something happens that then makes them to just really go off the rails with their eating or drinking. And that lack of control they have around food, particularly sort of snack foods and alcohol and other things that they've previously banned, they believe they have a lack of control of that, but that sabotage has actually been bred from over control. And it seems like such a weird dichotomy for us to get our heads around, that actually the more that we try and restrict, the more it harms us.
Yeah, I tell my clients often, because it does seem counterintuitive in a lot of ways, especially if you've been eating in a very controlled or restrictive fashion. It seems counterintuitive to think that by offering ourselves more permission, we feel more at ease around food. But I tell my clients, with increased permission around food, permission and access, like both of these things have to come in parallel. But with increased permission and access, we have more ease and less stress around food. I don't know if you use this terminology with any of your clients, but in the intuitive eating framework, we call that food habituation. It's the idea that the more we are exposed to certain foods, the less power they have over us over time. So as you're describing, that feeling of a lack of control around those foods often stems from being like over policed or over controlled. That's so true, because I compare it a lot of times. I don't know if this analogy will land, but I compare it to, if you pretend you have one of your best friends that you see all the time, you spend a lot of time with, and then all of a sudden something happens and they move really far away. And maybe wherever they move to, you don't have a lot of contact with them. Maybe they're like, I don't know, you can't FaceTime them, you can't email. So your communication is like cut off all of a sudden. And then a few years later, they move back to where you live. Maybe they become your next door neighbor, right? Within those first couple of days, weeks, or maybe even months of them living right beside you, you're going to want to spend a lot of time with them, because you have a lot of missed time to make up for. You have stories you want to share with them. You've missed them, right? But over time, since they bought the house right next to you, you're going to start to, realize, I don't need to spend every waking moment with this person, because they're going to be there. Like, they're my freaking neighbor. Like, I'm going to see them every single day. It's similar with food. When you haven't had access to a certain food, when you've cut ties with a certain food, often for a diety reason, and then you bring it back into your life in efforts to make peace with that food, there probably is going to be a period of time that feels a little chaotic, where you feel more out of control around that food. But the more it's around, the more it sits in the pantry, the more that you're taught you can trust yourself around that food, the more at ease around it you're going to feel. So I don't know if that analogy makes sense to you, but that's how I think about it.
It did, actually. Yeah, I quite enjoyed that analogy, because you're right. It's the food habituation is an interesting point, isn't it? Because it's often used with phobias, of that idea of like slowly introducing a spider across the other side of the room, and then you get closer and closer to the spider over time, and then eventually you're able to sort of touch or hold the spider or whatever, and you get there step by step. And with the friend analogy, likewise with the sort of, so cookies, snacks, biscuits, all the rest of it, these are the things that people struggle with, isn't it? It's not apples and vegetables and things like that, unless you've been really brainwashed by kind of carbohydrate science, well, pseudoscience.
Yes.
And it's funny, because I work with so many clients who are like, oh, I'm an all or nothing person. I can't control myself around X food or Y drink. And it is reminding them that has been bred from scarcity. It's the idea that you're not going to have it again. So you think, well, screw it. I'm just going to overeat this because I won't get it again. And that happens. I remember I tell a story quite regularly that when I was a teenager and my parents were dieting, we weren't allowed certain foods in the house, like snack foods. Whereas my friends' family, who were all really slim, all the family were super active, all the boys were really slim as well, they had a drawer that they called the biscuit drawer. And it became a running joke in the family that if I was coming round, they would have to stock up the biscuit drawer because I would go to town on that drawer, because I didn't have that stuff at home. They had cereal for breakfast, and I was like, what is this magic? Like, I'm here eating sort of dieting food or whatever at home, and these people are able to have Kit Kats in the cupboard. It was like heaven for me as that teenage boy.
I'm smiling so big as you tell that story, because I was the family that had the so-called biscuit drawer. No, I
Right.
did not call it a biscuit drawer. I called it
Yeah.
like the candy cabinet or something like that.
Yeah.
Way
Yeah.
less fun to say than the biscuit drawer.
Yeah, it's different languages, really, aren't they?
Different.
English and
It
American English.
it's so funny. Just as an aside, when we talk about biscuits, it's like
I know
I
what
don't
they
know
are.
what.
They're like the like doughy type rock type things. They're like our scones, effectively. I've had them before.
Yeah, and they're often savory as
They
well.
are.
You can have like chicken and biscuits or
Yeah.
something like that. So I have this visual when you say biscuit drawer of just like this drawer piled high with just these biscuits that my grandma would make. I'm like,
Yeah,
what?
yeah,
A
yeah.
biscuit
No, no,
drawer?
no. I totally get. I went to when I did my masters, I was at college with two Americans, one from
Mm-hmm.
Texas and one from Indiana, and the one from Indiana made us like a Thanksgiving dinner one time, and she did like biscuits and white
American
gravy
biscuit.
and things. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah.
totally on board with what you think when I say that. So cookies would be a better cookies and
Cookies.
candy.
Yeah. But my family, I mean, going back to my story, I told you I feel very privileged to have had a great upbringing around food. And
Mm-hmm.
something that my parents did is we had an open candy drawer policy,
Mm-hmm.
much like your friend's biscuit drawer, right?
Yeah,
Whenever I
yeah.
would come back from trick-or-treating on Halloween, all of the candy would go in there. And because my access to that was never limited, because I was
Mm-hmm.
allowed to go and have a piece when I liked, oftentimes the candy that I got from trick-or-treating would last for like the whole year. Whereas a
Yeah.
lot of my friends, they would come over and their home environment was different, and that
Mm-hmm.
they were only allowed to have that on Halloween night. So when they came over to my house, it was this really novel experience of, what do you mean we can have as much of this as we want? And I, as a kid, I never really understood why it was such a big deal to them. I
Yeah.
was like, what? Like, this isn't how you guys have it at home, right? Not really having the nuance or the understanding as a child. But now I see that I had access and permission, whereas in their household, the story wasn't the same. So, of course, their experience around that was going to be different.
I've actually got a question about that then, Claire, because
Mhm.
I don't, you know, working with parents is very interesting because I work, a lot of my clients now are parents now that I'm of a certain age and I'm beyond the mid-20s fit professional that I used to be, who
Mhm.
encouraged everyone to track their macros and cook food into Tupperware. So, apologies for all the clients I worked with 5 years ago, but with working with parents, it's interesting talking with them about how they're acting with their kids around food.
Mhm.
Because I do get a lot of questions at seminars around, well, what do I do then if my kid wants to have dessert rather than savory food? Or what do I do if they won't finish their main meal, but then they expect dessert? Because they're saying, oh, well, finish your vegetables before having dessert, or, well, we can't just have candy all the time. And they really struggle with that idea of giving unconditional permission to eat, particularly if their kid maybe does have, or they're concerned of their kid's attitude to food and weight already.
Mhm.
It's a really, really tough landscape, I find, to help them bring in that unconditional permission to eat for their children, because I guess they're still working on it for themselves.
Yeah. And I have a couple things to say in response, but I feel like I do have to lead by saying I do not have kids of my own, so I
No, so
cannot
neither
say,
do I, and that's
yeah,
why I'm
yeah,
like, I was like, I can't give you any really advice because I'm
yeah,
sure I'm
I
going to
can
struggle
give
when I have them.
yeah, I can give thoughts based on, my training and based on the work that I've done with parents, but I cannot speak from personal experience. And, I've thought before on all of the podcasts that I've been on where I've spoken about kids and eating, if and when I ever choose to have kids in the future, I might listen back and laugh. Because I think a lot of the time, from what I learned from my clients who are parents, is you don't know how the whole feeding littles process is going to go until it happens. But, something that I can say just from training and also, again, working with clients who are parents is that when we present food as a reward, like you even said a moment ago, you can't have dessert. You can't have the biscuits until you finish the broccoli or whatever it is. What that communicates to the child, right? Because again, earlier I said I didn't have the capacity for nuance, right? Kids don't. What they hear then is that the cookies are bad, we shouldn't have those, and the broccoli is good, right? And what happens just as human beings when we're told we can't have something, or, ooh, that's so special over there that it's reserved for special times? Of course, we're going to fixate on it more. Especially as a kid, I call that the like rebellious teen attitude. If I'm told I can't do something or I shouldn't do something, I'm going to fixate on it more. So I actually follow, I believe her name on social is the Everyday Table, Everyday Plate. I can send you her
But I
info, but
think
she does.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
think I know who that is.
Yeah, on TikTok, she does a lot of really amazing stuff involving intuitive eating and feeding kids. And something that she presents a lot is this idea of offering a meal with a lot of different foods present. Now, I don't mean you have to empty out the whole fridge or anything like that, but you put dinner or whatever it is on the plate and you put dessert alongside it. And there's no mention of eat this first, eat that first. And what we see when there are no labels placed on food, when the kids have access to the variety of foods like this, knowing that, there's a level of privilege that comes with that as well, the food access piece. But when they have access to these foods and they're not moderated, or they're not told one is bad or one is good, that they end up eating a little bit of everything, right? And it's not this fight. It's not this push to eat one over the other. It just kind of happens. So I don't know. I would recommend anyone who's interested in that to look at her content.
Yeah, if we get the exact URL, we'll put it in the description of the episode for people to follow, because that's the thing. It's very similar from me. Like, okay, well, this will be hard for you to like get your head around now, because you're coming from a place where you've had the upbringing from your parents, and then that's where you're coming from, and then your fears around your children's eating are then the same. It's like,
Right.
okay, I'm worried about them doing X, Y, and Z. And so I always refer out to people I know who are more experienced in that space. So it's definitely good to have more people to follow there. I would ask Claire, because obviously you said that you were the family that had the biscuit drawer and whatever, and you had this, but you found that the dietetic course moved you away from that because of the numbers. Was it purely that numbers focused and science focused thing that pulled you away, and more, is that when you started to experience more disordered eating? Was there any form of thoughts around you needing to be perfect in that? What brought that on if you had such a great upbringing from
Yeah,
it?
it's quite the contrast, right?
Yeah,
It's quite
that's
the
what I thought.
contrast. Yeah, I would say it was a number of things. It was definitely, like I was saying earlier, the idea of, in order to be a trusted, now I don't believe this now, but I'll say what I believe then, in order
No,
to
sure.
be a trusted nutrition professional, I had to eat a certain way. I had to look a certain way. I had to act a certain way around food. Like I remember back in college, I ate quote unquote perfectly, right? I was kind of in a period of time where I was arbitrarily cutting out some food groups and some foods that at the time I labeled bad. And whenever I would go out to dinner with friends, or especially when I was with family and extended family, because they knew I was this very regulated eater, when I would choose to eat something that strayed a little bit from our definition of quote unquote healthy or classical definition, it would always be a conversation like, ooh, Claire's eating that, right?
Yeah.
And I don't blame anyone for doing that. I think we're trained and conditioned as a society to make comments about other people's food. It's highly inappropriate, but it's normalized. It's normalized. And I was also kind of setting myself up again as this person who never ate anything in the bad category. So people were surprised when I did. So that was something that was playing a role. I remember this one specific assignment that I had to do in one of my introductory nutrition classes. And I hope to God they do not make students do this anymore. Maybe I should reach back out to that nutrition department and ask, give them a piece of my mind. But this one assignment was that we had to track in MyFitnessPal everything that we ate for, I don't remember if it was a week, a couple of weeks, whatever it was. And in order to get a good grade on the assignment, you had to have everything logged. Like, how messed up is that? And you said before we started recording, I think, at least, I hope I'm not misremembering, but you referred to yourself like perfectionist, type A, right? A lot of dietetic students fall into that category. I am no different. I like things to be a certain way, and I'm very particular, and I always wanted to be someone who got good grades, of course. So think about that mindset then placed behind this thing where I had to be really strict about my eating and monitor and track calories. It just made me hyper aware of things that I had never really thought of when I was growing up. And because I was made more aware of those things, that is really what contributed to me knowing more than was helpful about food. Knowledge is power, but there is such a thing, I think, as too much knowledge leading you down a negative path.
Well, yeah, definitely. And then there's knowledge that leads to inaction and all the rest of it. You know,
Mhm.
people use seeking knowledge as a safety behavior, don't they, to actually stop themselves from taking action because they're worried
Mhm.
about it not being the right thing or the perfect way or whatever.
Oh,
And as I said earlier, you know, from someone who had done just different diets and meal plans and things, for someone who was then introduced to tracking as the way of flexible dieting,
Mhm.
and that's for the YouTube viewers who can see the air quotes. The premise for me at first was amazing because I was like, oh my God, like I can have cereal at night and I don't need to feel bad about it. From someone who did CrossFit, and I was a CrossFit coach at the time, I was always the chubby one as a CrossFitter because everyone in CrossFit is just ridiculously lean. And I found this flexibility that allowed me to eat Lion Bar cereal. That was the favorite cereal in the evening. And the only reason I'm chuckling about that is because one time I came home from coaching evening classes and my housemate, who's one of my closest friends from school, had eaten the last bit of my Lion Bar cereal
No, he didn't.
and hadn't got any more. And we lived across the road from a 24-hour Tesco, which is a supermarket in England, and hadn't bought any more or told me that he had done it so I could buy more on my way home because I literally passed it on my way home. So I was fuming. Anyway, by the by, let it go. Anyway, I got so obsessed with tracking that, like, you know, I had a lot of calories to play with because I was so active at the time, and I would celebrate myself if I could get my macros bang on. And there were times I could, which is an art in itself, but also it's funny how, and I think this is why a lot of people struggle with it, Claire, is that in our world of social media, because of the information ocean that we are now within, there are so many people that actually have disordered eating practices that are celebrated as healthy and disciplined. And that's the worry.
Yeah, it's a big worry. And it's so interesting that you bring this up now. I made a post yesterday from the day that we are recording on that very topic. I think I titled it something along the lines of,
oh, I commented on it.
Yeah. Oh, you did. It's all coming back to me now, but I titled it Disordered Eating Behaviors That Are Often Mislabeled as Healthy, because the line between healthy and disordered is very, very blurry in our world. To give your viewers and listeners an idea of some of the things, is it okay if I list some of the things that I put in that post? Just to give an idea, because sometimes I think we don't even think to consider these behaviors as being unhealthy or disordered because they're preached by so many. So one of them is cutting out entire food groups without medical necessity, or cutting out a food in general if it's not medically necessary. Now, a medical necessity being something like an allergy, if it makes you feel absolutely terrible, if it causes you awful GI distress, right? But if none of those things are present and you're feeling the need to never touch a certain food, that could be coming from a disordered place. Another one, we were talking about tracking a moment ago with the cereal. But if you feel compelled or like you have to track or measure every single bite of a food that you're eating, that in my mind is a pretty disordered thing. There's room to explore what might be going on there. I'll leave it that way. What is another one that I listed out? Oh, this will bring us back to the baking and the cooking conversation. But if you are presented with a new and a fun recipe and you feel like you have to make a healthy swap, right? Like if you can't use this ingredient, you have to go to the store and buy this thing that costs 10 times more and tastes 10 times worse, then that might be coming from a disordered place. Again, nothing wrong with occasionally wanting to make swaps or experiment. I think there's room for that. But if it always has to be that way, or you don't have permission to eat something as is, listen, grandma's biscuits were always meant to be made with white sugar and white flour. Am I right? Yeah, but these are some of the things that are often promoted as healthy. And the last one that I'll list that's coming to my mind is stepping on the scale and allowing what you see to dictate how much you feel as though you're allowed to eat that day.
Yeah, that's a really good one. That is a really good one. And it's interesting, isn't it, Claire? Because like we come, I think, from experience of like both sides of the coin, which obviously then helps our clients, because then we need to help them through that journey, because we are a very diet focused culture, particularly in the West, the US and the UK, because we've got such high rates of health related diseases and a high overweight population. And a lot of people blame the amount of food that we have as a reason for that. And it's funny, the more that we look into this, but actually the more we try and diet and control and shame and all the rest of it, the worse these things get. The people that do diet after diet after diet don't actually lose weight. They actually just get heavier year on year and less happy with themselves. And the weight on the scale is one of those things. Weight on the scale and BMI are both just such poor perceptions of someone's health that we rely on them because they're our only forms of data that we feel are logical, and that's what we're told to do. And it's so sad that you'll get people who will step on the scale after being very, very positive with their action steps. I've been eating more vegetables. I've been eating more intuitively. I'm not labeling foods. I'm enjoying foods when I want them, but I'm not sabotaging myself anymore. And all, I'm exercising more and for enjoyment's sake, and I'm doing really well with all these things. But then they step on the scale and they've, not lost any weight. And it's like, and it's not working.
Yep.
And it's like, well, you're judging yourself from an outcome that's so fickle versus empirical data of improved action steps. And it's such a shame that we get so warped into those numbers being the most important data points when they're just not at all.
Yeah. Well, I think it can be really easy to fall into a headspace where we're viewing weight or weight loss as the sole metric of quote unquote success, because we still live in a world, even my dietetics training, as I've been referencing throughout this whole podcast, where we are taught that weight is the end all be all of health. And in order to be healthier, weight loss or achieving a certain BMI or a certain weight range is necessary. Where this gets a little slippery is with what you were saying, right? You were describing some of these behaviors that you work on with your clients of, I've eaten more vegetables this week, or I've just eaten a greater variety of foods in general. I'm engaging in a movement practice that feels good for my body. I would even bring in some stress management, right? I'm feeling less stressed around food. I'm maybe engaging in relationships in my life that are really meaningful, right? All of these dimensions of health. You could be working on all of those things and making wonderful progress, both physically and mentally. But if you step on the scale and don't see that number go down, you feel that all of those efforts are invalidated.
Yeah.
And if that is how one feels, I would ask, okay, what are we pursuing here? Are we pursuing health or are we pursuing weight loss? And our ideas of these things might be kind of crisscrossy. Sometimes they might go hand in hand. Sometimes they might not, right? Especially if you're working with someone who is really recovering from a lot of restrictive and disordered behaviors around food, where they've not been eating enough, they've been over exercising, food has been a major stressor. Healthy for them might be gaining weight, right? Might be letting loose on some of that control around food. And it's just such a shame. And I'm hoping we can maybe plant the seed with some of your listeners that pursuing weight loss and seeing the weight change on the scale doesn't always equal healthier, right? These behaviors that you're talking about, eating a greater variety of foods, rest, movement, stress management, relationships, all of the above, these are the things that relate to health. We call them the health promoting behaviors, but that is a hill I will die on till the end of my time here on this earth.
No, but it's a point really, really well made, because it's a shame that it's funny because we all have we do all have body image hang-ups at some point in our lives that we either then work through or we don't. And that comes from, again, the information ocean that we have. And it was a big point in the seminar I did on the weekend about, if your social media feed is actually making you feel worse about yourselves, you need to ask whether that's long-term helping you. Like, a lot of people follow these accounts as inspiration that actually make them feel guilty for the way they eat their food and make them feel guilty for the fact they don't have visible ab tissue or whatever. And I know from looking back at my CrossFit days, I had massive body dysmorphia, and then massive symptoms of sort of bulimia and orthorexia, though neither of those were ever formally diagnosed. And it was only years later when I was reading about these things and discovering much more about intuitive eating and the psychology around eating behavior, that I was able to see those symptoms and the symptoms of disordered eating within my past. And it is such a shame because BMI is a poor signal of health. It's a metric that's used because of the billions of people in the world. And if we were to use BMI upon myself, I'm dictated as, I think I'm in the obese category in BMI actually, because I'm not the tallest of men at 5'10". I'm not that short either. So, but anyway, I'm quite heavy. By the by, it's not that big a deal about health, is it? Because you can be really, really healthy if you exercise, you get fresh air, you get sun exposure, you sleep well, you have healthy relationships, you have hobbies, you eat a good variety of food, and you have low anxiety around food or around things in general. But we just don't see those because Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and newspapers and radio stations and TVs are just slapping us with Fitspiration and let's all get on a diet again this January.
Yeah, I mean, they present this idea of health, makes us feel that it has a certain look or it looks the same way for everyone. And that's simply not the case, because what feels good and what feels healthy for me might be different from what feels good and healthy for someone else. And it might look different, right? We have to understand that there's a lot of variation in that word health, and it means something different for everyone. That's actually one of the first questions that I ask a potential new client when we hop on the phone to see if we're going to be a good fit to work together. After we, get to know each other a little bit, we laugh, I'll ask, what's your definition of health? Or when you think of the happiest, healthiest version of you, what is that like? Could you describe that to me? And a lot of people really come back to, it's in how I feel. It's not only my physical health, but it's my mental health as well. It's how I'm interacting with the world. It's how stressed I feel. It's all of these things that really extend beyond weight manipulation. I know that might not be the case for everyone. Some people might be like, no, it really is in my weight. And if that's your story, that's okay. But I think it can be useful to consider expanding our definition of health and what that means.
Yeah, 100%. And it's helpful with clients to help them make that change because it's not easy. And particularly around people's body image as well. It's interesting, isn't it? How I've spoken to clients where they're speaking with me and they said, oh, it's so interesting because a few years ago I weighed X and I had sort of Y figure. And I look back now and think, oh man, I'd kill to be there. Like I'd be really happy being there. But at the time they were dieting and not happy with them, how they looked. And so I do have to ask that question. It's like, well, is it actually about your body weight then? Because I know for me, I was much slimmer in 2015 because that was when I was in this CrossFit tracking everything phase and had, abs to the nines and thought I still needed to lose weight, which is worrying. But I still thought I needed to lose weight then. I wasn't happy. Whereas I look back now and I was like, man, I was shredded then. And I know that I'm happier now, even though I have more body fat and I'm probably healthier in a more well-rounded sane as well.
Yeah, it really is an interesting comparison. I have similar conversations with clients, especially those who are struggling with body image. And I've had many of them share with me, I look back on old photos and my body was different. Maybe I was smaller because I was actively dieting, controlling my food intake, tracking my weight. And I, being like my clients, people who share the story with me, they say, I was so unhappy with my body then. And I thought that dieting more, losing more weight was going to lead me to feeling better about my body, but it never did, right? And it's just interesting because we're often presented this idea of the secret or the key to a better body image is losing weight or is looking a certain way. But I would wonder if a lot of the people listening, if they could think back to a time when they were actively manipulating or controlling what they were eating in efforts to improve their body image. Did that work? Did that have the outcome that was promised? And I don't know the answer from everyone listening, but from my experience, the answer to that question is often no, right? It did not deliver on that outcome.
More often than not, no. And funnily enough, then they're like, and after I was done, the weight I'd lost returned, and I'm now here still looking for something else for the answer. And yeah, it's just the cycles unfortunately we find ourselves in. of going back and forth with that until we find that idea of health being much more than just our body weight and how it looks, and then also finding satisfaction. The clients I work with who focus on health and who focus on exercising for enjoyment find that they get better results and feel better about themselves and all the rest of it. So hopefully we can move people toward that realm.
Yeah. The final thing that I'll say on the body image front, this is a plug. Another friend and colleague of mine who creates incredible content around body image and how to work on healing body image in a way that's detached from dieting. Her name is Brianna Campos. Her Instagram, I do know this one off the top of my head, but I'll send you the other one after we wrap. But
Yeah, we'll get both.
Yep, her handle is at Body Image with Bri, BRI.
Right.
And a lot of really great and helpful full content around body image. So if anyone is interested in going deeper on this side of the conversation, Body Image with Bri is where it's at.
Great. Well, yeah, I'll get the other one off you, and we'll put both of them in the
description.
You got it. Claire, it's been really great speaking with you today. Thank you for getting up and getting presentable and mentally acute for this 8 a.m. discussion. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I have really enjoyed it too, Johnny. You were a wonderful interviewer and just a human being to talk with. I know we said before we even logged on to this interview that there are a lot of crossovers in our approaches, and I knew this was going to be a great conversation, and I'm happy I was up and alert for it. So thank you so much for having me on, and to your audience as well for listening and sticking with us. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.